And start so we can take full advantage of everybody's time. Thank you all so much for joining us. As a quick introduction, I am Desiree Maruka. I'm one of the VPs of programming for the National Economists Club, and we're really grateful to have everyone on the line today, and especially our guest speaker, Dr. Mary Lovely. So I'm going to do a quick introduction for Dr. Lovely and then turn it over to her, and she will share some slides and give some remarks, and then we will move into a time of Q&A. So just a quick administration point. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will go through those at the end, or you can raise your hand on Zoom and I will call on you to ask your question directly when we move into that section of the program later on. So just to quickly introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Lovely. She is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and a professor of economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Her academic work focuses on the effects of China's reform and opening on the country's firms and workers and on the global economy. At the Peterson Institute, she writes about trade policy, global value chains, and foreign direct investment. Dr. Lovely has published essays and opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Financial Times, CNN.com, and the Milken Review, and has been quoted in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Bloomberg, Politico, and various other additional international publications. She earned her PhD in economics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard University. Dr. Lovely is joining us today to discuss China and the US long-term challenges and current policy priorities. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Lovely.
Thanks very much, Desiree. I'm really honored to be here today with all of you. There is probably 4 different talks to be given under this general rubric. I'll share some slides with you, some thoughts, and then I hope during Q&A we can either dive deeper into some of the issues that I raise, or we can approach some of the things that I don't mention. So again, there's just a whole lot on the plate here. Let me go ahead and share my slides in the interest of time. We don't have a lot of time together. I call it conscious uncoupling. That's of course a joke related to Gwyneth Paltrow's divorce. We might think of it as unconscious uncoupling as well, so I'll come to that. The future of US-China trade relations, of course, a very important topic. Some of you may have tuned in this morning. Ambassador Alan Wolf gave a talk at the Peterson Institute about the future of the WTO. Very interesting talk, covered many things, but of course the future of US-China relations is key, or at least extremely important, to the prospects for reform at the WTO, as well as just the future of the bilateral relationship. I just want to very briefly talk about where the Phase 1 agreement has left us. I'm not going to do a deep dive on the Phase 1 agreement. Certainly a lot has been written about that over the last 4 years. It's important to recognize, though, that the trade war tariffs remain in place. The tariffs on goods imported from China in the US remain at about 19%, perhaps a little less because of some exclusions that have been permitted. China's tariffs on US goods remain about 20%. So average tariffs. So it's clear that we still have a lot of, barriers in place. There was some progress has been made on other aspects of the agreement, but there's no consensus on the current status. That is, has China fulfilled the obligations that, as viewed by the United States? One very important one had to do with intellectual property protection. As you know, China has moved forward not only in changing how it deals with conflict or claims of intellectual property violations, but also a year ago, January, passed a new foreign investment law that explicitly rules out this and provided for more means of redress for foreign firms. Many of the most difficult issues in the relationship, however, remain on the table, the so-called Phase 2 issues. And they will be much more difficult to resolve, as everyone acknowledges. The first is US concerns about the role of state-owned enterprises, particularly as they interact with the market system and the global trading system. The second is industrial subsidies. The US has viewed subsidization in China as both non-transparent, but also as a method for unfair trade. When industries are subsidized, they may be able to underprice their foreign competitors in a way that is viewed as unfair. Third is technology transfer and cyber theft. There are still lots of concerns about technology transfer. In fact, in the most recent surveys coming out of American companies operating in China, there was a slight tick up in the number of companies who report being asked to share technology, but it still remains at about 13% of companies surveyed are saying that they're being asked to transfer technology by their local partners. That by itself is not a violation. Of course, forced technology transfer would be a violation of the agreements that are in place. And of course, cyber theft and cyber hacking continues. It's a big concern for the US and for the Biden administration. Lastly, the role of digitized information and how these intersect with China's security capabilities and US national security concerns. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, and I think it'll probably come up more in Q&A. Last fall at the Paris Peace Forum, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described a world that's riven by 5 fissures. And the first fault line that he identified was that between the United States and China. And he warned of the rivalry threatening to split the planet into 2 separate and competing worlds, each with its own trade and financial systems, internet and artificial intelligence platforms, and military alliance and strategies. I think this, his warning speaks to what's at stake in the relationship. And as we will progress, we'll see that it's going to be very difficult to find a way forward in this relationship. So I'm going to highlight 4 major economic frictions just very quickly. The first is bilateral trade deficit, something that former President Trump stressed repeatedly throughout his administration. We've heard less about it. And in fact, during the Biden campaign, there was expressed the view that this is not a good measure of the health of the relationship. However, I believe that it is something that has some appeal to people, particularly members of Congress, as a sort of bellwether for the relationship and whether it is quote unquote fair. The second point I will highlight is technology transfers, intellectual property rights, and industrial subsidies, which will continue to be an irritant in the relationship. Third, high-tech trade and investment in national security concerns, which in my view will be the most important conflict between the 2 countries over the next 3 years. And then lastly, US sanctions related to Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So this is human rights issues. So how we address these concerns will have long-term consequences for bilateral trade and investment, as well as prospects for reform at the WTO. So I think we can all agree that there's clearly a lot at stake here. First, on bilateral trade imbalances, China was moving toward basically trade balance globally. However, the US, that is likely to change. And part of that will be the US trade deficit is likely to worsen as the US grows more quickly than other economies and as the US government adds to the government budget deficit. China is continuing to become more deeply embedded in global tech supply chains, so its role at sort of the end of global supply chains will continue, and that means that a lot of times the budget deficit will stop, the trade deficit will stop with it. As we all know, the trade deficit is not on a value-added basis, so the fact that China will receive a lot of inputs from other countries and then export to the United States does affect the size of the trade balance. And US-China trade will remain unbalanced unless I think costly trade barriers force a deficit to move to other parts of East Asia or Mexico. And my point here is simply that policy matters, and particularly US policy toward electronics. It is important to note that computers and electronic devices constitute more than 1/3 of the import bundle, US import bundle from China. And so what happens in that sector is vitally important to the overall relationship. Here's just a quick thing from the latest IMF World Economic Outlook. I'm sure some of you are already familiar with this, showing global economic imbalances, the fact that they have widened in 2020 and that they're projected to widen further in 2021. The dark blue here is the United States, and you can see that after remaining fairly constant, it's set to widen. The dark green is China. And China seemed to be on a path after the great financial crisis where it widened toward basically balance. And again, earlier, 3 or 4 years ago, and now widening again. And a lot of that, this blue and dark green increase will show up as an increase in the US trade deficit with China. As technological supply chains evolve further, China's share of the US deficit will, unless affected by policy, will grow organically. Here, this diagram is just to show the US's product design going into China, and then China, as well as semiconductors and packaging and other aspects, particularly in like the electronics sector. And then we see coming from China, component subsystems and final assembled goods. As China has gradually widened the set of activities that it can perform, certainly its share of the value of the iPhone, for example, has more than tripled. You will see China share of the US deficit growing along with it. The second irritant is there's no resolution of US complaints underlying the trade war, despite the phase 1 agreement. The main complaints of forced technology transfer from US companies to China, the fact that China was basically strong-arming US companies to license their technology at what they saw as unfair rates, predatory outward investment by China, and cyber theft of US intellectual property. I put here how each of them have been dealt with under the Trump administration. The first was dealt with, of course, with the Section 301 case that was the legal basis for the trade war tariffs that Trump imposed. And of course, we had the Chinese retaliation on that. We took a case to the WTO on licensing. Predatory outward investment, that is China's acquisition of technology companies, is something that was addressed in the new revised CFIUS rules, so heightened review of inward investment from China. This is something that we have been joined with by the Europeans, who have also made changes not only to individual member state law, but also to having a broader coordination across the European Union. And then lastly, cyber theft, which US law enforcement has been very involved with. It's sort of interesting to go to the FBI website and look at the cases of cyber theft of US IP. Some of them are frankly a little surprising. Even within the last 5 years, there are cases where, basically a scientist has walked in, stuck in a stick drive. I mean, I'm being a little flip here, right? But in stolen technology. So law enforcement and of course, companies protecting themselves against that has heightened over the time. And lastly, subsidies and SOE concerns as we move ahead. This is just one diagram from some work that I've been doing that looks at restrictions on foreign entities owning wholly owned subsidiaries in China. We look at 3 different groups here: high-tech, capital-intensive sectors, and labor-intensive sectors. And you can see for all these sectors, it's 10% of sectors or fewer that still have these remaining restrictions. And of course, the Chinese have moved since this ends at 2007, to remove even more restrictions. So the type of problems or conflicts that we're going to see in IP are really changing over time. They're not going to be ones that are easy to say, well, you forced us into a JV. They're going to be of a different caliber. And one of the things that in my work, I believe we've often overlooked is Chinese provision of subsidies to multinational corporations to locate. Those have diminished, but still remain in industries that China sees as key to its future development. So I guess a simple way to put it is it's not all sticks, it's also carrots. And China has a lot of carrots, one of them, of course, being access to its very large and growing domestic market. Progress on IP protection has been made. Part of it is that the cost of leniency that is looking the other way in IP protection, whether it's by individual companies or by provincial governments, has really outweighed the benefits for the central government. Not only has it brought the country into conflict with the United States, with Japan and the European Union, but there's also growing awareness that as an increasingly innovative country, China really needs these protections on its own. And China has really increased its R&D activities domestically, as well as a host for R&D for multinational corporations. And so it has its own reasons to want to increase IP protection. It has changed the legal architecture surrounding IP protection, including specialized courts and a national intellectual property appeals court, as well as certain protections available to US firms under the Phase 1 agreement. And as I mentioned before, the new foreign investment law that China adopted responds directly to many of these concerns. Now, what will this do? Well, one of the ironies of the Section 301 case was that what the US basically sought was better conditions for US firms investing in China. So a better climate for manufacturing firms and service firms who would be considering investing in China. I say it's ironic because, of course, at the same time, there was a lot of concern about US jobs being sent to China, or sent being, again, used very loosely. But it does look like these increasing enhancement of the foreign investment environment in China has, despite which you would say, well, I've heard a lot of things. Xi Jinping is tightening things as a nationalist backlash, less freedom for foreign firms operating in China. We have to have a Chinese Communist Party cell inside the firm. Yes, but at the same time, there have been increased freedom for them in other ways. And as a result, foreign investment into China has actually increased. China has moved forward in completing regional integration in the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And that is basically an umbrella for a lot of bilateral or agreements, trade agreements, and agreements between ASEAN as a group and other nations. But there's one really key thing about RCEP, which is a focus on common rules of origin, so that once something is begun to be made within the region, that common content can be added up to make it basically available for duty-free entry into any of the RCEP nations. So clearly the countries were focused on really enhancing this Asia-Pacific region as a production network. So something we've already associated with it, it expands the set of countries that will be part of that, and looks to enhance it by simplifying the rules for aggregation of content across the various countries. China has also moved up 32 places on the World Bank's ease of doing business indicators. Again, even as we see the Chinese take steps that we might think would be a turnoff to foreign investors, they take steps that make it more profitable to operate in China. Now, what does this mean for the US-China economic relationship? Well, first, commercial interests in the US will not want to decouple from either partner. And we have seen this in surveys of US companies operating in China. Many of them report not wanting to scale back their activities, and many wanting to continue or even enhance their investments in China. And further attempts by the US to decouple will incur costs. If the US moves in that direction to force a decoupling, by the same token, they will incur costs if the Chinese undertake activities or policies that make it less desirable. We did see a significant movement of trade with the US-China trade war. That certainly made it more costly for firms that were operating inside China as an export platform. And I just want to remind or state that for US companies operating in China, the main attraction is to serve the Chinese market. Less than 15% of the value of their goods goes back to the United States. But there are many other multinationals, so Taiwanese, Japanese, South Koreans, who export from China to the United States. And we saw a decrease in imports from China with the tariffs. Remember, the tariffs at this point average close to 20%. And we saw over this period a decrease in imports of those goods that were subject to tariff of about 30%. Unfortunately, that did not move back to the United States. We saw much of it move to partners who were already exporting those particular goods to the United States, much of it within Asia. Okay. The third component is, of course, security concerns, and these are rapidly taking precedence in the relationship. This is the first time the United States since World War II has really faced another country that has the capability to really compete with the United States in terms of global surveillance. So China, if we look at the large digital platforms, there's only two countries that are really playing in that space. One is the United States, second is China. And second, if we look at the ability to undertake surveillance, we see again, the Chinese are beginning to rival the United States in that. This is a national security concern for the United States, as well as its allies. The US government, I believe, is very worried about it. Many people have raised this. Some of them see it as overblown. Some of them see it as we're not taking it seriously enough. So there's a very wide range of opinion on this. We have seen additions, particularly under the Trump administration, to the US export control lists. We have seen the US campaign to remove Huawei from global 5G networks, and they've had some success, particularly among rich allies, not so much among developing countries who need access to less costly technology. This perhaps division along telecommunications will continue. The Chinese are moving ahead very quickly in so-called 6G and have the largest share of patents in 6G. This could grow to concerns with Chinese parts and what I call in the Internet of Things. So how far will this concern about Chinese involvement in US technology and US telecoms? The Internet of Things tells us that basically everything will be connected to the telecoms network. And where does our concern about Chinese involvement stop? We saw with the TikTok and the use of algorithms that in this area, we're just really not, we don't have a clear view on what it is that we need to protect ourselves against. So these fears will continue to be heightened as China's role as an inventor and manufacturer continue to grow. China's doubling down on R&D, particularly in the artificial intelligence space, but in really all kinds of technologies related to interconnected design and manufacture. So they're no longer simply a link, they're a designer and a producer, and there's a heightened fear and it will show up within the trade and investment relationship. It's clearly already shown up in the investment relationship. Chinese investment into the US tanked even before the global pandemic, and now we have more threats to trade. Again, reflecting on the fact that computers and electronic devices, as well as other electronics, have formed the backbone of this relationship since the early double aughts. So sanctions are turning up the heat on the relationship, not only the export sanctions, which I already mentioned, but also sanctions against Chinese entities for a variety of concerns. There were new officials and entities added last month over American human rights concerns about Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We have withhold restraint orders on exports from the Xinjiang region. So there's a number of different flashpoints in the relationship. So export controls, sanctions on persons and entities, and then stopping of trade from certain regions. China has responded. We know that China is quick to retaliate. We've seen that in its behavior toward other countries, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. China has hastily put together what's called a blocking rule. It was put into place as a statute in January of this year. And it is an attempt by Beijing to push back against US sanctions. It basically said that any Chinese company, and that would include foreign multinationals who have foreign subsidiaries registered in China, would need to inform the Chinese government when sanctions are preventing a commercial relationship between a third-party nation and a Chinese entity, and it requires then that the US sanctions be ignored, and that any loss for the domestic Chinese company from another company complying with US sanctions could be recoverable in court. This is modeled after a European Union blocking statute that was put in place following the Iran and Cuba sanctions by the US early on. But it's unclear how China will use this, how broadly it will apply it. So far, sanctions that prevent sale of certain types of semiconductors by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation have not been countervailed in this way, but it does set up the mechanism by which China could play a harder ball in this game of sanctions. Here's just a list that Jeff Schott at Peterson prepared, going through all the documents on the types of sanctions that we have against Chinese individuals and Chinese entities, and why we have them. We have just updated this, and we'll be having something in the next couple of weeks out on these sanctions and the new blocking law. So I'll just end with asking, conscious uncoupling, Chinese cooperation on the main US complaints is likely to have a positive impact on investment to China, not only from US, but of course from other countries. US expansionary policy will drive up the US trade deficit with China. Yet unresolvable tech security issues will be driving a wedge in the relationship and forcing the opposite type of pressure on integration with China, at least as far as the US and its allies are concerned. We haven't even talked about tech talent and what's going on in the movement of people and communications between the two countries, but those are, of course, being forced to adjust in light of this rising uncertainty. Lastly, let me just say a couple words about the Biden approach. The new administration is in the process of review and policy formation. So far, they don't seem to be in any hurry to change what was in place at the end of the Trump administration, in particular to remove the trade war tariffs. The new US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, has made some mention of using them as leverage in her testimony before Congress, but that has yet to be seen. We do know that the Biden administration will be drilling down harder on human rights concerns and very likely on national security issues. which we've discussed. Lastly, I think there's a bigger question of how China fits into Biden's so-called middle-class trade policy. There has been little movement away from the view that China's export growth was a negative shock to American workers. I mean, even though the Biden campaign was quite sophisticated in its critique of the Trump tariffs, they have accepted the view that Chinese exports were bad for particularly blue collar and unionized workers, I believe. And after last night's speech, where we have a blue collar blueprint, I think it's hard to see where China fits in. This is something that they're going to have to articulate following their review. US Trade Rep Tai embraces vigorous enforcement, which basically means more countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties against so-called unfair traders, which we might surely see China in the crosshairs, as well as enhanced labor standards. She has said very little about new rules and new liberalization, so we're unlikely to see much by way of new attempts to negotiate trade agreements. Their main focus now is on strengthening and broadening the American economy, and as Biden mentioned last night, competing with China. So it's really right now not clear how they will begin to resolve some of these issues. Wendy Cutler today has a nice piece out in Bloomberg Opinion talking about ways in which the Trump tariffs could be scaled back, including by restarting the exclusion process, so letting US companies that are being hurt by the tariffs apply for exclusions, as well as perhaps working with China to cut them gradually. So having a, as US Trade Rep Tai has said, use them as leverage for changes in the overall relationship. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lovely. That was a great overview. Just to let everyone know again, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or to enter your question into the chat. So I see a first question from Mark. Oh, it's not a question. It just says, this is a real eye opener. We are dealing with a woke giant. I hope it is not too late. So I think that's just a comment from him. So while people are entering their questions, I can start with my own first question, if that is okay. And I work mostly in international economics. So definitely, you know, China is a big piece. But my question is sort of looking at the uncoupling or maybe unconscious uncoupling of China and the US. How do other countries factor in? So how has the sort of failing relationship with the EU or maybe the rising influence China is having in Africa, how does that kind of impact what the US might want to do with their relationship and how hard or soft of a line they might want to take? And then vice versa, does that incline China in any certain direction with policies that they might have?
And that's a great question. And thank you for asking it. The Biden administration has said repeatedly that they will work with allies and have certainly made that a priority early on. However, there is a lot that divides, particularly the US and the EU. I think at the top of that list has to be a carbon border adjustment tax, as well as differences in how we view digital trade, digital privacy, et cetera. These are not tiny disagreements. These are major disagreements. And I think that in some sense, healing this relationship and finding a way to resolve these difficult issues is going to be key to any kind of united approach. The Japanese have really hung in there. They did the hard work of getting the TPP over the finish line. They have been involved keeping even, during the Trump administration, which exhibited quite a bit of hostility toward the World Trade Organization. They were there pulling the United States toward a multilateral approach. The US, the EU, and Japan forwarded a trilateral statement on subsidies and how to tame subsidies. My own reading of it was that there was even in that document, you can see considerable disagreement between the US, on the one hand, and the EU and Japan on the other on how to handle that. And China obviously not going to agree with any of it. So, you know, we have these two very important relationships, and there's a lot of work to be done. I believe that the Biden administration understands that, is on the way, but we can't kind of minimize the challenge there. In terms of the rest of the world, it's Asia has really moved forward in terms of integrating. And China is the #1 trading partner with almost all countries outside of the NAFTA region. So there was an interesting diagram that just looked at the ratio of US to China trade by country. And the map, 10 years ago was pretty split between blue, US, and red, and now it's majority red. So China is a very important trading partner for every country, and that means that they're going to have to try to find a way forward. Of course, it depends a lot on Chinese behavior and how China responds. China, frankly, has surprised me in how aggressive it has been in pushback early in the trade war. I wrote a piece saying that they would not do anything to really jeopardize their role in global value chains. I think, lastly, more of their sort of warrior, diplomacy and their pushback, particularly how they've responded to Australia with its call for greater transparency in investigation into how the virus emerged in Wuhan, have surprised many of us. So China's behavior is clearly going to matter here, as well as the United States. When we look at Asia, Central Asia, and parts of Africa, of course, the pandemic has brought a pause in, or at least a slowdown in the Belt and Road Initiative. And China itself is recognizing some of the weaknesses in its approach of the Belt and Road. And of course, the rising concerns about debt and debt dependency. Other countries have pushed back as well. They have recognized the potential trap that they might be in. At the same time, China is pushing forward with the digital Silk Road. And so it sees, getting its 5G equipment in there, linking these countries economically to China. It's a very expansive vision, and I think it's one that really lays an enormous challenge at the US door. So lots of challenges there, Desiree. I don't see easy answers.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. Our next question says, in the 1970s, quota systems were introduced to try and rebalance US and Japanese trade. Have you heard anyone discussing such a concept with regards to China?
I have not. Under the Trump administration, and a lot of things there just seem kind of fly by the seat of the pants, right? We all of a sudden got the trade tariffs, and no dispersion to anyone who worked on those tariffs, but I think for all of us it was just like boom. The community economists were called upon to devise the tariffs and to try to minimize the harm to American consumers. We saw the tariffs, unfortunately, levied mostly on producer inputs, which clearly had a greater harm to U.S. manufacturers, but basically spared, Christmas toys and shoes and things like that the final consumer sees, where basically they come across not for much further processing, but basically to go on the shelves of Walmart and Target, et cetera. So, we didn't see this talk about a quota system. However, it really depends on how we see China evolving, the role of state-owned enterprises and subsidies. Ambassador Wolf this morning reminded everyone of the great John Jackson, who years ago spoke about the need for some kind of interface between a planned system or non-market system and the market-based economies. And we thought we were outgrowing that need. Even in the TPP, we saw Vietnam become, allow for disciplines on its state-owned enterprises, and Vietnam surely can be considered a winner in the trade war if one measures it by the amount of activity that was pushed toward Vietnam. So we didn't expect to be in this position. I think that it's very possible we'll see something like that. However, I also want to warn against taking the most strident position or views as a given. I have colleagues at Peterson that are looking at the total market capitalization of Chinese companies and finding that it's actually private firms that are increasing their share of the top market caps, driven in part but not entirely by, of course, the tech giants that we hear about. Alibaba, Tencent, and others. So the private sector still exists in China. It has grown. It particularly grew between 2000 and the Great Financial Crisis. There is some concern about that, but in many of the things that we trade actively with China, it is dominated by Chinese private firms, not by the state-owned enterprises.
Great. Okay. How do you see semiconductor supply chain issues between China and Taiwan and the US playing out?
Wow, this is from Pete Davis. Well, Pete, I wish I knew, because then I could become hopefully a very rich woman. This is a really, really thorny issue, and it's not clear what will happen. I think the US has also, since the moves made by the Trump administration, become aware of dangers to this. For example, under the Trump administration, companies were not allowed to join specific international standard setting bodies. And there was enormous pushback saying that if US companies were not setting global standards, we would not remain global players. So how we decouple, or, I think at a minimum, we're going to continue to see certain products not being traded. How strongly China pushes back against that. So for example, we already have constraints on the sale of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the software that's used to design chips. China, of course, is pouring tons of money into creating its own alternatives. We have really, one of the things that Americans, I think, sometimes overlook is the fact that some of what China does is a reaction to what we're doing. We kind of think of them as on their own path. So they have really moved up this drive for indigenous innovation and self-sufficiency in response to what they see as hostility from the United States, from existential threats to the United States, from cutting off technology. And the United States has to admit that we have done enormous damage to Huawei's, at least one part of its business segment, by refusing to sell to them. So these export bans in the short run can be very powerful. In the longer run, China is determined not to be dependent. And so I think that it's going to be hard for the Biden administration to sort this out, to try to achieve important national security goals without kneecapping some of our leading tech companies.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump around a little bit to make sure everyone gets one question asked. So our next question is China continuing to export its workers to third world countries and therefore increase its physical presence and influence?
Yeah, I have to admit, Michael, I don't know what has happened in the pandemic to China's outward migration. Some of this has come through the Belt and Road, not only with Chinese companies who bid for the construction and bring their own workers, but also through Chinese merchants who follow them to provide goods and services, and then become local shopkeepers and merchants selling Chinese products, and of course engendering some resentment from local populations. How much this has continued under the pandemic, I don't know. One of the important things to remember is not only that China's labor force has stopped growing, but that China has basically withheld its census, probably because for the first time in 5 decades, Chinese population has actually stopped growing. So the era of sort of surplus labor, or labor that could move off of the farm into cities, and make this, when we think of sort of a two-sector model with the urban rural sector, this no longer characterizes modern day China. We're working in a China where wages are rising. It's a large reason why companies, particularly in labor intensive activities, were already moving away from China well before the US trade war, well before the pandemic. So it's unlikely that they're going to continue to export lots of workers to the third world.
All right, an easy and I'm sure short answer for the next one. What is the most important thing the US must do now? If you had to pick, I guess, just one thing.
I would say that I think it's the thing that the Biden administration clearly gets right, which is reinvigorating its relationship with its allies. I think that the Trump approach, which was quite transactional, what's in it for us, had a very, very negative effect. Even talking with officials throughout the European Union on a visit I made in 2019, you could just see the frustration and the feeling that they were not going to be the US patsies. Now, clearly there were improvements that needed to be made, allies that needed to shoulder more of their burden or take larger responsibility. But working with these allies is going to be critically important in solving this issue with China. We already know it's critically important for probably the most existential threat we face, which is climate change. And the Biden administration is doing that. So I think that is the number one thing. And it is the key to making progress on the US-China relationship as well.
Great. Has the WTO been largely neutralized as a result of outright trade manipulations, unilateral tariffs, and COVID crisis and supply chain interruptions?
I think, the WTO faces a lot of problems. And I don't think outright trade manipulations or unilateral tariffs are the most important ones. It's, 164 countries, I believe, sometimes. And it hasn't progressed since its founding. So it is largely has rules that need to be updated. That's another nice way of saying it's outdated. If you think back to the early 1990s, we were, 15 years away from the iPhone. So think about how our life has changed, the role of digital trade. Clearly the role of China changed dramatically, the role of global value chains, the importance of electronics trade, China's growing role in terms of surveillance capabilities. These have all changed. What we expect from intellectual property regimes as they intersect with digital rules, cloud, who owns the cloud, who owns your data. These are all questions that just haven't been addressed. There are also ways in which the WTO itself always was a bit flawed. It doesn't really have a chief executive. The executive is there mainly to keep keep things moving, not to actually drive forward an agenda. Now we have Madam Ngozi. She's doing what she can, in particular, to use the WTO as a force for good in the pandemic, to use it to keep border restrictions away from the process, to help countries coordinate. But she has an enormous agenda in terms of getting some type of reform. Most people who are really close to the WTO, like Alan Wolf, like Annabelle Gonzalez and others, believe that there is going to have to be, in some sense, different speeds for different folks, that we can't get 164 nations to agree to the same reforms. Not everybody's going to put their hand up. And so we're going to have a set of rules that move forward for certain countries, whether it's on environmental goods. We've been largely trying to negotiate fisheries subsidies for years, something that there's no one that really denies that this is important, and yet we've been unable to. So it would be really great to get that settled, to get perhaps an environmental goods agreement within the WTO, but right now it's not happening. Another key feature is to have the WTO be seen as a force that doesn't counteract domestic political will. So for example, the US has always complained that when it uses what it sees as a more aggressive trade remedy agreement, so its use of how it calculates, for example, countervailing duties and dumping duties, these are found to be wanting at the WTO. It's accused WTO rulemaking when it should just be enforcing existing obligations, not setting up new ones. This is something that's going to have to be fixed before we can fix really the appellate body. So right now, the WTO has been largely neutralized. I think that's a huge problem, but we can't just wave a magic wand and say it's fixed. We're going to have to find a way to do it. Now, as I raised in a talk, what is a middle class trade policy? This is something that we have yet to be seen. I think USTR TIE is saying it is one where we'll have vigorous enforcement. And so I think you will see the Biden administration being very interested in working with other countries to get these types of reforms to the WTO. There is some administrative agreement on perhaps an oversight on the dispute settlement, perhaps by the dispute settlement body itself, to allow it to move forward with the United States re-engaging.
Great. Excellent answer. Thank you. One final question says, is China developing its own aircraft industry? And what does that mean for Boeing and Airbus?
The answer is yes, it is. It's well along. In regional jets, it's trying to develop the big guy. Scott Kennedy at CSIS has an interesting report on this process, and in particular, the difficulties that China has run into, basically with a state, mandated and overseen process of what is ultimately a very complex industry, highly fragmented, lots of parts coming from lots of different places, as well as the need for innovation. So it's been a difficult process for China. It is unclear as to when they will. I think they will eventually. It's unclear if US regulators will ever approve these planes for flying into the United States, which would clearly limit their adoption by airlines outside of China. China is a huge market for US aircraft as well as for Airbus. So it is, in some sense, certainly something that these companies have already figured into their business plans for the future. But we have to remember that both the US and EU regulators are going to have a lot to say about whether these aircraft ever really fly outside of China.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We appreciate your time so much, and thanks to everyone for joining. If I can just take 1 minute while I have everyone on the line and just remind you of a couple upcoming events we have in May. Next week, we will be, I just dropped my paper, of course. Next week, we will be talking to Mr. Adam Smith, an applied climatologist from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, about risk and resilience, billion-dollar disaster analysis and US infrastructure. And the week after that, we have the chief economist from the Associated General Contractors of America, Ken Simonson, who will be talking about the post-pandemic outlook for US construction. So more information and registration links are available on the NEC website, and then keep an eye out for emails from Robin as we continue to do events throughout the summer. Thank you so much, Dr. Lovely. That was great, very informative, and I think provides a wonderful context as we keep moving forward in this complicated but important relationship with China. So appreciate it.
With my fellow economists, and I'm very happy I didn't have to follow Adam Smith.
Okay.
So
yes.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.